I never imagined that the night I collapsed at my own family dinner table would become the moment everyone turned against me. They whispered, they sneered, and worst of all, they claimed I was faking it. But when the paramedics arrived and their report revealed the truth, nothing could ever be the same again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emily Carver, and for most of my life, I had been the sort of woman people described as resilient or tough. I was raised in the small town of Crestwood, Indiana, the kind of place where everybody knew each other's business and reputations clung to you like shadows. For me, the shadow was my health, or rather, the perception that I never really had any issues. I had always been the one to put on a smile, even when my body screamed otherwise. The last thing I ever wanted was pity. And so, over the years, I had learned to downplay the dizzy spells, the sudden waves of exhaustion, the chest tightness that came without warning. I told myself it was just stress, that I was overthinking. My husband, Greg, a no-nonsense mechanic who believed in pushing through everything, reinforced that idea. "You're tougher than you think, Em," he would often say when I complained about the shortness of breath or the unexplained fatigue. "Don't baby yourself." But the truth was, I had been running on borrowed time. My body had been trying to warn me for months, maybe even years, and I kept ignoring the signs. The night it all came crashing down was supposed to be simple, a family dinner. My parents, Richard and Martha, were hosting. My younger sister, Claire, and her fiancé were coming too. The Carvers weren't known for warm gatherings. Our dinners were more like interrogations, served with mashed potatoes and green beans. Still, I tried to keep the peace. I had promised myself that night would be different, that I'd swallow down the barbed comments and survive a few hours for the sake of family tradition. I remember walking into my parents' dining room, the chandelier light reflecting off the polished mahogany table, the scent of pot roast heavy in the air. Everything looked ordinary, but beneath the surface, tensions hummed like a live wire. Claire, as usual, eyed me with that sharp mixture of judgment and smugness. She'd always been the successful one in the family, the one with the degree, the job in finance, the diamond ring that sparkled a little too perfectly under the lights. Next to her, I was the older sister who had settled, married young, no degree, still working part-time shifts at a diner to make ends meet. It didn't matter that I had dreams of my own or that I had been quietly sketching designs for a small clothing boutique I wanted to open someday. To them, I was simply the girl who hadn't lived up to her potential. Dinner started the way it usually did, with my mother commenting on my weight, my father asking why Greg hadn't found a real job yet, and Claire casually dropping hints about how together her life was. I felt the familiar knot in my chest, the one that came from years of being compared and diminished. I pushed food around my plate, tried to focus on steadying my breathing, ignored the way the room spun slightly when I stood to refill my glass of water. Then it happened. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. My fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate. I felt heat rushing to my face, then cold sweat prickling across my skin. My vision blurred, the chandelier above me warping into streaks of light. I heard Claire's voice, annoyed, impatient, as if from far away. "Emily, what now?" she sighed. I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. My chest tightened like a vice, and suddenly the ground disappeared beneath me. I crumpled forward onto the table, the sound of gasps and scraping chairs echoing in my ears before everything went dark. When I came to, I wasn't met with concern. I wasn't met with love. Instead, I heard my mother's sharp, disbelieving voice cutting through the haze. "She's faking," Martha said flatly. "She always does this for attention." The words sliced through me harder than the pain in my chest. My father grunted in agreement, muttering something about me being too dramatic. Claire's laughter, clipped and cruel, followed. "Honestly, Emily, if you wanted to ruin dinner, you could have just said so." I tried to lift my head, tried to tell them that something was wrong, that this wasn't just stress or nerves, but my body refused to cooperate. My limbs felt heavy, my lungs tight. Greg, instead of rushing to my side, stood off in the corner, his face unreadable. "She's done this before. She makes a scene when things don't go her way." The betrayal was complete. My family didn't see me as a woman in crisis. They saw me as a burden, a manipulator, a liar.
I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my body betrayed me as much as their words did. It was Claire's fiancé, Mark, who finally broke the spell. "Something's not right," he said firmly, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling 911. My mother rolled her eyes, my father sighed, Claire groaned, but Mark didn't care. Within minutes, the sound of sirens wailed outside, and the paramedics rushed in. That was the night everything began to unravel. The night my truth collided with their lies. The night the paramedics' report would expose more than just a medical emergency. It would expose the way I had been treated all along, and the hidden truth none of them wanted to face. And as I lay on that stretcher, struggling to breathe while my family whispered accusations around me, I realized that my life was about to change forever. The days leading up to that fateful dinner had already been heavy with tension, though no one else in my family seemed to notice. To them, everything appeared normal, the same weekly routines, the same small-town gossip, the same quiet assumptions about me never quite measuring up. But beneath my forced smiles and polite nods was a truth I carried alone. I wasn't well, and I hadn't been for a very long time. For months, I had been hiding episodes of dizziness, chest tightness, and a fatigue so overwhelming that some mornings it felt like climbing out of bed required summoning the strength of 10 people. I brushed it off with excuses, blaming it on stress, dehydration, or lack of sleep, because that's what everyone expected of me. I was the daughter who cried wolf, the sister who overreacted, the wife who made excuses. The last thing I wanted was to hand them more ammunition to use against me. At home, my coping mechanisms had become routine. I kept a notebook by the nightstand where I tracked my symptoms in secret, never daring to let Greg see it. He had grown weary of my health complaints long ago, brushing them off as dramatics. "Emily, you're fine," he would grumble as he laced up his work boots each morning. "Stop Googling every little ache. People have real problems." I learned not to argue, just to quietly document the shortness of breath, the fluttering heartbeats, the fainting spells I narrowly avoided by gripping the edge of the counter until the dizziness passed. At work in the diner, I smiled through the fatigue, splashed cold water on my face during breaks, and prayed no one would notice when I leaned against the counter just to stay upright. My manager, Denise, sometimes gave me questioning looks, but I always deflected with a joke or a shrug. No one could know how fragile I really felt, because no one would believe me. The problem ran deeper than just physical symptoms. It was the way my family had conditioned me since childhood to swallow my pain, to downplay my needs, to accept that my word held less weight than theirs. Growing up, Claire was always the golden child. When she got a fever, my mother rushed her to the doctor and cooked her soup for days. When I felt unwell, I was told to toughen up. My father's refrain echoed through my memories. "Emily, stop pretending. You're stronger than this." Even as a child, I learned that acknowledging my pain was seen as weakness, and weakness wasn't tolerated in the Carver household. That conditioning followed me into adulthood. Every time I tried to voice my health concerns, they were met with eye rolls or accusations of attention-seeking. At some point, I stopped trying. It was easier to hide, easier to suffer in silence than to endure the chorus of disbelief. I became an expert at masking, at telling myself I could push through just one more day, one more family gathering, one more exhausting shift at work. But deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong. It was the weight in my chest, the nights I woke up gasping for breath, the way my heart seemed to stumble over itself. Still, denial was safer than being ridiculed yet again. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. That's why the family dinner loomed over me like a test I already knew I'd fail. I dreaded those evenings, not because of the food or the setting, but because of the conversations that always turned into competitions. Claire would flaunt her achievements, a new promotion, a wedding venue booked, another luxury item she had purchased. My parents would nod approvingly, their eyes shining with pride. Then they'd turn to me, their smiles fading into disappointment. And how's the diner, Emily? Still scraping by? My mother's words always carried the sting of comparison. I knew the script too well, and yet I showed up anyway, partly out of obligation and partly because some small part of me still hoped for their acceptance.
The irony was that my body had been screaming louder than my family's criticisms. The week before dinner, I had fainted briefly in the diner's break room, coming to on the cold tile floor with my coworker shaking my shoulder. "You need to see a doctor," Denise urged, but I waved it off, embarrassed, muttering something about skipping lunch. The truth was, I had been putting off making an appointment because I dreaded hearing what I already suspected, that whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. And worse, I feared telling my family and hearing their voices confirm what they'd always said, that I was exaggerating. So I pushed through, telling myself I could handle one dinner, just a few hours of enduring their cutting remarks. I even dressed up that night, putting on a navy blue dress I hadn't worn in years, hoping it might make me appear stronger, more put together. I practiced steady breathing as I walked into my parents' home, forcing myself to stay upright even as a dull ache radiated across my chest. They didn't notice, of course. My mother's first words were about how pale I looked. "You should really try some iron supplements," she said, shaking her head. Claire smirked, whispering something to her fiancé that made him chuckle. I laughed along, pretending not to feel the faint wave already creeping over me. The hidden problem wasn't just my illness. It was the prison of disbelief I lived in. I knew that if I collapsed, they'd say I was acting. If I spoke up, they'd accuse me of lying. And so I had learned to keep my truth locked away, hoping that sheer willpower would carry me through. But as I sat at that dinner table, listening to their voices drone on about wedding plans and career milestones, I felt my body betraying me. I sipped water to hide the tremor in my hand, shifted in my seat to disguise the shortness of breath. No one noticed. No one cared. To them, I was invisible unless I failed, and even then, they'd deny the failure was real. Looking back, I see how the stage was perfectly set for the collapse that followed. My silence had become their weapon, and my pain had become their proof of weakness. The hidden problem wasn't just my failing health, it was the way my family had convinced themselves that my suffering didn't matter, that it was nothing more than a performance. And that belief, more than anything else, would shape how they reacted the moment I hit the ground. The night of the dinner began like so many others before, but even as I sat at that table, I could sense something within me shifting. My body had been whispering warnings for months, and I had ignored them. But that night, those whispers had turned into screams. The more I tried to focus on the conversation, the heavier the air seemed to grow around me. Every inhale felt incomplete, like I could only capture half the oxygen I needed. My hands trembled under the tablecloth as I pressed my palms against my knees, silently willing my body to hold on. I told myself if I could just make it through dessert, I could go home and rest, and nobody would have to know. But the truth is, the old way of coping, hiding, deflecting, pretending, was unraveling, and there was no going back. The dinner conversation was its usual cruel rhythm, a symphony of passive-aggressive jabs and thinly veiled comparisons. Claire, with her perfect manicure and her fiancé beaming beside her, was in the middle of describing their upcoming trip to Italy. "You know, Emily, you should really try traveling sometime," she said with a mock concern that didn't reach her eyes. "It broadens the mind." My mother chuckled in agreement, tossing me a look as though to say, "Why can't you be more like her?" I forced a smile, my chest tightening as I tried to swallow both my resentment and the sharp edge of pain that had begun radiating beneath my ribs. Greg sat silently, staring at his phone, as if disengaging himself from the battlefield around the table. He didn't defend me, didn't notice the way I clutched the edge of my chair to keep steady. His silence had become a second kind of betrayal, just as sharp as my family's words, but quieter, harder to call out. I wanted to reach for him, to whisper that something was wrong, but I already knew how he'd respond. He'd tell me to calm down, to stop overthinking, to stop embarrassing him in front of my parents. And so I swallowed it, as I had so many times before, even though my body was screaming for help. It was around the time dessert was served that the breaking point came. My mother had just placed a slice of apple pie in front of me when the first wave hit. It was stronger than the dizziness I'd felt earlier, more violent than the chest flutter I'd grown accustomed to brushing aside. The room tilted violently, the chandelier above swinging like a pendulum in my vision. My fork slipped from my hand again, but this time I didn't bother to pick it up. My breath caught in my throat, shallow and ragged, as though an invisible weight was pressing down on my chest. I reached for my water glass, but my fingers wouldn't obey, knocking it over instead. The glass shattered on the floor, the crash silencing the table.
Honestly, Emily, when Mother snapped, her voice sharp with irritation, must you always make a mess? Her words cut through the fog, but I couldn't respond. My body was folding in on itself, trembling as I fought for air. My father groaned and leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Here we go again," he muttered, as if I were performing some tired routine. Claire rolled her eyes dramatically, her lips curling in disdain. "She's faking it," she said with an exasperated sigh. "She just wants attention. She always does this when it's about me." Her fiancé shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from me to her as though unsure whether to intervene. I wanted to shout at them, to tell them I wasn't pretending, that something inside me was breaking apart in real time, but my voice wouldn't come. All that escaped were shallow gasps as my vision tunneled, the edges going dark. I tried to push myself upright, but my body refused. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was my mother crossing her arms, her face hard with disbelief, while Claire smirked like she had won some invisible battle. When consciousness returned, I was on the floor, my cheek pressed against the cool hardwood. The voices around me weren't filled with concern, but with annoyance. "She's fine," my father was saying. "If she really wanted us to believe this nonsense, she could at least put some effort into it." Claire's laughter rang sharp in my ears. "She's unbelievable. Always has to be the center of attention. It's pathetic." My mother's voice was cold, dismissive. "She's faking. She always has been. Don't you see? This is her game." It was in that moment, lying on the floor while my family accused me of deceit, that the truth hit me harder than the collapse itself. The old way of living, hiding, downplaying, begging silently for their belief, was over. I had reached the breaking point, and whether I liked it or not, the world would now see what I had been trying to hide. Their whispers couldn't change the way my body had betrayed me, nor could their accusations erase the urgency in my gasping breath. Something irreversible had happened, something that no amount of dismissive words could undo. Mark, Claire's fiancé, was the only one who seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. His voice cut through the noise, steady and insistent. "This isn't normal," he said firmly, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling 911. My mother groaned, rolling her eyes. "Don't be ridiculous. She's pulling one of her stunts." My father grumbled about overreactions, but Mark didn't waver. "No, look at her. This isn't an act." His voice rose, sharper now, demanding attention. "She needs help." The old way, keeping silent, hoping for understanding, was shattered in that moment. I could feel it, even through the fog and the fear. The breaking point had come, and from here there was no return to the careful balancing act I had tried to maintain. Someone outside the circle of disbelief had finally witnessed the truth, and his decision to act would set in motion everything that came next. The sirens were already on their way, faint at first, then louder, drawing closer with every passing second.
My family might have dismissed me, but the world outside was about to step in, and with it, the possibility that the lies I had lived under for so long would finally start to unravel. The breaking point wasn't just about my body giving out, it was about the lie I had been forced to live under collapsing too. And as I lay there on the floor, gasping while my family muttered about dramatics, I realized something terrifying and liberating all at once. Nothing would ever be the same again. The first sign that the night was about to spiral into something my family could no longer control came with the sudden burst of red and blue lights flashing outside the dining room window. For a moment, the house fell into a tense silence, broken only by my mother's exasperated sigh and Claire's muffled complaint about how dramatic this was becoming. My father muttered under his breath about wasted taxpayer money. But Mark remained at the door, phone still in hand, eyes scanning the driveway as the sirens drew closer. For me, consciousness came and went in fragments. The pounding of my heart, the cold sweat dampening my skin, the murmurs of disbelief circling above me like vultures. And then, with the slam of a car door and hurried steps on the porch, strangers entered the space my family had controlled for so long. 2 paramedics strode into the room with brisk efficiency, their presence instantly shifting the air. They weren't burdened by years of bias or bitterness. They didn't know me as the daughter who supposedly overreacted or the sister labeled as weak. To them, I was a patient in crisis, and that objectivity was like a lifeline. The taller of the 2, a man with graying hair and steady hands, crouched beside me. "Emily Carver?" he asked firmly, his voice carrying a calm authority. My lips barely moved, but I managed a faint nod. "All right, Emily, I'm gonna help you. Just stay with me."
My mother's voice cut in sharply before he could continue. "Oh, please," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "She's fine. She does this all the time to get attention." The paramedic ignored her. His focus locked on me as he shined a small flashlight into my eyes and pressed 2 fingers against my neck to check my pulse. The younger paramedic, a woman with dark hair pulled into a bun, was already unpacking equipment from her bag: blood pressure cuff, oxygen mask, monitor leads. Their quiet, efficient movements contrasted so starkly with my family's dismissive chatter that the difference felt like night and day. "Her pulse is irregular," the man announced to his partner, his brow furrowing, "and she's diaphoretic." He reached for the oxygen mask and fitted it gently over my face. Cool air flooded my lungs, easing the suffocating weight in my chest. For the first time that evening, I felt a glimmer of relief. Someone was taking me seriously. My family's voices continued in the background, a chorus of denial and irritation. "I told you she was faking," Claire scoffed. "She's perfectly capable of getting up. Look at her. She's already responding now that you're here." The younger paramedic shot her a sharp look. "She's not faking," she said firmly. "Her vitals aren't normal. This is real." Claire bristled, her arms crossed defensively, but she didn't speak again. The simple authority in the paramedic's voice carried more weight in that moment than all of my protests ever had. Outside eyes were now on the situation, and the narrative my family had clung to for years, the one where I was always exaggerating, was beginning to fracture. Greg finally stirred from his corner, his voice hesitant. Is it serious?" he asked, his brow creased, though whether from concern or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. The paramedic didn't look at him. "We need to get her to the hospital. I can't say more until she's evaluated, but this isn't something you ignore." His words landed heavy in the room, hanging in the silence that followed. My mother's lips tightened as if she wanted to argue, but for once she stayed quiet. Perhaps even she realized how hollow her protests sounded compared to the objective professionalism of strangers. The paramedics moved swiftly, attaching adhesive patches to my chest and connecting wires to a portable monitor. The beeping confirmed what I already felt, the erratic stumbles of my heart. "Possible arrhythmia," he murmured to his partner. She nodded, preparing a stretcher. "We'll need to transport." The medical language was foreign to my family, and for the first time I saw flickers of uncertainty in their eyes. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fiancé's hand tightening over hers. My father rubbed his jaw, clearly wrestling with the fact that this was no longer something he could dismiss. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, the room that had always been filled with judgment and disbelief suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. I caught sight of my mother's face, her expression tight, almost angry, as though my collapse had ruined her evening. My father avoided my eyes altogether. Greg followed half-heartedly, shoving his phone into his pocket. Only Mark's gaze met mine, steady and unflinching, as if to silently reassure me that I wasn't alone anymore. The stretcher rolled toward the door, the wheels squeaking against the hardwood floor. My family trailed behind, their murmurs blending into a single, uneasy hum. I caught fragments of their words, overreacting, hospital bills, making a scene. But over it all, the paramedics' calm, professional voices rose clear, logging my condition, marking my symptoms, affirming with each word that I was not a liar, not an attention seeker, but a patient in need of care. For the first time in years, the truth wasn't just mine to carry. It was documented, measured, undeniable. When they loaded me into the ambulance, the younger paramedic adjusted my oxygen mask and offered a reassuring smile. "You're going to be okay, Emily. We'll take care of you." The words nearly undid me. After years of begging silently for validation, a stranger's compassion felt like salvation. Through the open doors, I saw my family clustered on the porch, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. They weren't in control anymore. The story they had spun about me was slipping from their grasp, unraveling under the weight of monitors, vitals, and professional eyes. As the ambulance doors closed and the siren wailed to life, I realized the truth had finally begun to pierce through the veil of lies. The outside world had seen me, really seen me, and once that happened, there was no going back. The narrative my family had clung to so tightly was cracking, and the first evidence, the first red flags, had already emerged. This was the point of no return, the moment where the truth, once glimpsed, demanded to be followed. And though fear still crooned in my chest, alongside the erratic thuds of my heart, I knew one thing with certainty. The lie they had built around me was beginning to crumble, and the truth would no longer be ignored.
The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor strapped beside me. Every bump in the road seemed to jolt through my chest, and though I tried to keep my eyes open, the oxygen mask pressed against my face fogged with each labored breath. The paramedic riding in the back, the older man who had first knelt beside me, kept his eyes trained on the monitor while occasionally adjusting the straps on my arm cuff to check my blood pressure. "Stay with me, Emily," he said calmly, his voice grounding me when everything else seemed to spin. "Your heart's been acting up. We're going to find out exactly what's going on." Those words lingered with me, hovering in the space between relief and fear. For years, my family's voices had drowned out my own instincts, but here was someone collecting proof, logging numbers, documenting what my body had been trying to tell me all along. When we reached the emergency department, everything happened in rapid succession. The stretcher wheeled through double doors, bright fluorescent lights replacing the dim warmth of my parents' dining room. Nurses in scrubs descended on me immediately, voices calling out vitals, numbers, and orders in a kind of practiced choreography. Electrodes were stuck to my chest, wires connected to a larger monitor, and an IV line slid into the crook of my arm. Each beep, each line of data felt like validation, objective evidence that couldn't be dismissed with a scoff or an eye roll. I was no longer just Emily, the overly dramatic daughter. I was a patient with medical records, numbers, and professionals who were taking me seriously. The doctor arrived shortly after the initial tests, a woman with tired eyes but in efficient manner. She introduced herself as Dr. Lawson and immediately began reviewing the data the nurses had gathered. She asked me questions: how long I had been experiencing chest pain, whether the fainting spells were new, if I had a family history of heart issues. I answered as best I could between shallow breaths, my voice trembling not just from fear, but from the sheer weight of finally being able to say out loud what I had been hiding all along. "It's been months," I admitted softly. "Sometimes I feel like I can't breathe. My heart races. I get dizzy. But they always told me I was overreacting." My voice cracked on the last words, though I didn't clarify who they were. Dr. Lawson gave me a look that was both firm and sympathetic. Emily, you're not overreacting. These symptoms are real, and they need to be taken seriously. You're here now, and we'll figure this out. The words struck me harder than I expected. For years, I had carried the shame of being dismissed, and in just a few sentences, a stranger dismantled that shame with the power of professional validation. My chest still ached, but a different kind of pressure eased slightly inside me, the pressure of not being believed. Meanwhile, the evidence kept stacking. Blood samples were drawn and sent to the lab. The EKG printouts showed irregular rhythms that the nurse clipped onto a chart. I could hear the team murmuring medical terms I didn't fully understand. Arrhythmia, tachycardia, possible myocarditis. Each term was like a foreign language, but they all carried one undeniable truth. This was not in my head. Something was happening inside my body, something measurable and real. In the waiting area, I knew my family was gathered, their conversations laced with impatience and disbelief. I could almost hear my mother complaining about how long everything was taking, Claire lamenting that her evening had been ruined, my father muttering about exaggerated nonsense. Greg would be sitting in silence, maybe with his arms crossed, unwilling to admit even to himself that he had ignored the signs. But what they didn't know was that every passing moment, more proof was being collected, each test stripping away their narrative piece by piece. Dr. Lawson returned after an initial round of tests, her expression grave but professional. Emily, your EKG shows some irregularities we need to investigate further. We're admitting you for observation and we'll run additional tests overnight. I need you to understand, this isn't something to brush aside. She paused, her gaze steady. This could have been very dangerous if you hadn't come in tonight. The words settled heavily in the room. Dangerous. Not dramatic, not attention-seeking, dangerous. And though part of me recoiled at the reality of it, another part of me felt vindicated in a way I had been longing for. For years, I had carried the shame of being dismissed, and in just a few sentences, a stranger dismantled that shame with the power of professional validation. My chest still ached, but a different kind of pressure eased slightly inside me, the pressure of not being believed. Through the haze of exhaustion, I noticed the younger paramedic entering the room with a clipboard. She gave me a reassuring nod before handing the chart to Dr. Lawson. Patient presented with diaphoresis, shortness of breath, syncopal episode at dinner. Family reported history of fainting spells, though they were dismissive. I flinched at the word dismissive. Even the paramedics had noticed. It wasn't just in my head. It was real enough to be recorded, preserved in ink on an official report that no amount of denial from my family could erase.
As the hours wore on, the gathering of evidence became relentless. Machines recorded my heart rhythm. Nurses logged my blood pressure every hour. Blood tests ruled out some causes and pointed toward others. I overheard discussions about electrolyte imbalances, possible inflammation, and scheduled imaging for the morning. My body, which had been the battlefield of denial for so long, was now producing proof that no one could refute. But with every piece of evidence came a gnawing fear. What if it was something irreversible? What if the years of dismissing my symptoms had caused damage that couldn't be undone? The thought chilled me, but it was matched by another. What if the truth finally forced my family to see me differently? Would they acknowledge it, or would they double down on their denial, even in the face of undeniable proof? The night stretched on in the hospital room, machines humming softly around me. I clutched the thin blanket, my body weary but my mind restless. The truth was no longer just mine to carry. It was being recorded, measured, analyzed. Evidence was building like a wall between my reality and their lies. And while I didn't yet know what that evidence would reveal, I knew one thing for certain. My family's narrative about me was beginning to collapse under the weight of facts they could no longer ignore. Morning crept into the hospital room slowly, the sterile light of the hallway spilling in as nurses made their early rounds. I hadn't really slept. My body was too wired with nerves and exhaustion to fully rest. The constant beeping of machines monitoring my vitals had become a strange kind of lullaby, both unsettling and reassuring at the same time. Each beep was proof that my heart was still working, still fighting, though not in the smooth, steady rhythm it should have been.
I stared at the ceiling tiles, their uniform pattern breaking only when I blinked, and I thought about how different life looked from here, how different I felt knowing that for once, the truth was being documented line by line on charts and screens. By mid-morning, Dr. Lawson returned, her white coat swishing slightly as she entered the room holding a clipboard. Her expression was serious but not unkind, the kind of demeanor that doctors wore when they had to share something important. "Emily," she said, pulling up the stool again so she could be at eye level, "we've gotten back some of your test results. We need to talk about what they show." My chest tightened, not with pain this time, but with dread. I braced myself for whatever words would follow, knowing instinctively they were going to change everything. "Your EKGs and overnight monitoring showed significant arrhythmias. Essentially, your heart isn't maintaining a proper rhythm, which explains the fainting spells and chest pain. We also ran blood tests that revealed elevated markers suggesting possible myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle. We're scheduling an echocardiogram to get a closer look, but Emily, this is serious." Her words landed like stones in my stomach. Serious, dangerous. All the things I had been trying to convince my family of for months, maybe even years, now being confirmed with clinical certainty. My heart wasn't just being dramatic, it was malfunctioning, and it wasn't something I could simply walk off or push aside. Dr. Lawson continued, "We're admitting you for longer observation, and we may need to start medication right away depending on the echocardiogram results. You'll also be restricted from any strenuous activity until we can stabilize this." I nodded numbly, trying to absorb everything. Part of me wanted to cry, part of me wanted to scream, "I told you so!" to the world, and part of me wanted to curl up into myself and disappear. But before I could even find the words, I heard the commotion outside the door. My family had arrived. The door swung open and in spilled my mother, father, Claire, and Greg. Their faces carried a mix of impatience and forced concern, though Claire looked more annoyed than anything. "Well," my mother said, brushing her hair back with a dramatic sigh, "are they finally done running all those unnecessary tests? Can we go home now? You've caused enough fuss for one night." Dr. Lawson turned to face her, her professional demeanor sharpening like a blade. "Mrs. Carter," she said firmly, "your daughter is very sick. This isn't fuss, and it's not something to dismiss. Emily has a heart condition that could be life-threatening if not treated properly." The room fell into silence for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down like a heavy curtain. My father crossed his arms, his brows furrowing. "A heart condition? She's 23. She runs, she works. She's fine. The sound's exaggerated." Dr. Lawson didn't flinch. "It's not exaggerated. We have the EKGs, the lab results, and the overnight monitoring to prove it. Emily has been experiencing arrhythmias and signs of myocarditis. These are measurable, documented facts. This isn't something she's faking or imagining. If she hadn't collapsed last night, the situation could have been much worse. You need to understand, your daughter's life was at risk."
The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's lips tightened as though she wanted to protest but couldn't find the words. Claire rolled her eyes and muttered, "Unbelievable," under her breath, but even she didn't sound as confident as before. Greg's face was harder to read. He shifted his weight awkwardly, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking between me and the doctor. For once, their skepticism wasn't enough to drown me out. The evidence was undeniable, and someone in authority was standing up for me. Tears prickled my eyes, not from fear, but from a strange cocktail of relief and grief. Relief that I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't all in my head. Grief that it had taken collapsing on the floor and being hospitalized for my truth to finally be acknowledged. I looked at Dr. Lawson, silently thanking her for cutting through the lies my family had woven so tightly around me. Dr. Lawson stood, tucking her clipboard under her arm. "I'll give you some time with your family, but Emily, we're moving forward with the echocardiogram this afternoon, and I strongly suggest your family start preparing themselves to support you through what comes next." With that, she left the room, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving the silence heavier than before. My mother was the first to speak.
Well, doctors overdiagnose things all the time, she said sharply. They're probably just being cautious. I'm sure this will blow over like it always does. I shook my head, my voice steadier than I felt. No, Mom, this isn't like before. They have proof. My heart is damaged. This is real. My words cracked in the middle, but I pushed through them anyway. I could have died last night. Claire scoffed, folding her arms. You're being dramatic again. People faint all the time. Doesn't mean you're some tragic case. Greg finally spoke, his voice low. Claire, maybe we should listen? The doctor seemed pretty serious. His words were hesitant, but they hung in the air like a fragile thread, threatening to unravel the narrative my family had clung to for so long. I stared at him, searching for sincerity in his face, and for a brief moment I thought I saw it. Recognition, guilt, maybe even a sliver of regret. But before I could latch onto it, he looked away. Still, the cracks were showing. The truth was breaking through their denial, one undeniable fact at a time. As the day stretched on, more tests followed. The echocardiogram revealed inflammation around my heart, confirming Dr. Lawson's suspicions. Treatment plans were discussed, medications ordered, restrictions placed on my activities. Each new piece of information was another brick in the wall of truth. And with each brick, the lies my family had built began to crumble. They could deny me, belittle me, mock me, but they couldn't argue with machines, numbers, and scans. For the first time in years, I wasn't begging to be believed. The proof stood taller than their voices, stronger than their scoffs. And as I lay in that hospital bed, my body weak but my spirit steadier than it had been in years, I knew one thing for certain. My family's dismissal was losing its power. The truth had emerged, undeniable and unshakable. And from this point forward, everything would change. By the time evening fell over Crestwood, I had been in the hospital for nearly 24 hours. The fluorescent lights of my room were harsh and unyielding, illuminating the stark reality I had finally begun to confront. The medical reports, the EKGs, the lab results, they were no longer abstract. They were tangible proof of what I had been living with all this time. For the first time, I didn't have to hide behind excuses or suppress my fears. I had the undeniable evidence to back up every concern I had ever raised. Yet, as the room grew quiet with the fading hum of machines, I realized the next challenge wasn't medical, it was personal. The real battle was about to begin, confronting my family with the truth, choosing to stop shielding them from what I had endured and making them face the consequences of their disbelief. When my parents arrived again, it was obvious they had been speaking to one another in hushed tones. My mother's lips were pursed tighter than ever, her hands clasped in a rigid knot. My father's expression had hardened. He looked like a man trying to maintain control over a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. Claire lingered at the doorway, her eyes sharp and judgmental, clearly skeptical even after everything she had seen. Greg stood silently behind me, and Mark, the only family member who had consistently seen my truth, remained at the edge of the room, ready to intervene if necessary. I knew in that moment that I had to make a choice. I could continue to let them dismiss me, continue to bear their judgments quietly, or I could speak openly, loudly, and firmly, letting the facts of my reality confront them head on.
I took a deep, steadying breath, the oxygen still flowing from the mask pressing against my face. My voice was quiet at first, a fragile tremor, but it gained strength with each word. I need to say something, I began, keeping my eyes locked on my mother's, then my father's, then Claire's. Everything you've said over the years about me being dramatic, overreacting, faking, none of it is true. You've been wrong, and you need to understand how serious this really is. My mother's eyebrows shot up, and Claire rolled her eyes in disbelief, but I pressed on, fueled by years of silence and suppression. I collapsed at the dinner table last night because my heart isn't working properly. I have arrhythmias. I have signs of inflammation in my heart muscle. The paramedics documented everything. The doctors have scans, tests, and reports. This is not pretend. This is my life, my body, and my experience. You all ignored it for years, and now you're faced with facts that you cannot deny." My words seemed to reverberate against the sterile walls of the hospital room, demanding recognition, demanding accountability. My mother opened her mouth to interject, but I held up my hand. "No, you need to listen. I've stayed quiet for years. I've swallowed your disbelief, your comparisons, your accusations. I have tried to make you see me without attacking, without raising my voice. But I can't do that anymore. I am choosing to speak because I will no longer let you rewrite my reality. I am sick, and I am being treated for a serious heart condition, whether you like it or not." There was a pause, a charged silence in the room as my words hung in the air. My father's jaw tightened, his hands gripped the edge of a chair. Claire's smirk faltered, and she shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. Greg's eyes softened, but he didn't speak, as though he were weighing the enormity of what I had just said. Only Mark met my eyes with unwavering support, giving me the small, reassuring nod that reminded me I wasn't alone. "What about your health insurance?" my father asked finally, his voice low, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "How long is this going to take? Are you sure you're not just exaggerating for attention?" I felt a surge of anger, but also clarity. "No, I'm not exaggerating. You can look at every EKG, every lab result, every observation the doctors have recorded. They will tell you what I'm telling you is the truth. I could have died last night. Do you understand that? And the reason I survived is because someone finally believed me, Mark, the paramedics, the doctors, not because you ever took me seriously." My words were sharp, slicing through the fog of years of dismissal. I could see their faces blanch slightly, the edges of their certainty crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. My mother opened her mouth to interject, but no. No words came out. My mother shifted her weight, suddenly aware that the ground beneath her assumptions had shifted. My father cleared his throat, though he remained silent, and Greg finally spoke, hesitantly. "Emily, if this is true, then I—" He stopped, unsure how to navigate the revelation. The room was heavy with tension, but also with the weight of something inevitable. The truth had been revealed, and the lies and denials that had defined our interactions for years were now on trial. By choosing to speak, I had crossed a line. There was no going back to silence. No soothing platitudes, no polite deflections could undo the confrontation I had just initiated. I had exposed the reality they had ignored, forced them to witness my vulnerability and the consequences of their disbelief. In that moment, I realized that this choice, this bold act of honesty, was not just about me, it was about reclaiming my life, my voice, my autonomy, and forcing the people who had invalidated me to reckon with the consequences. The paramedics' documentation, the doctors' reports, the monitoring devices, all of it had prepared me for this moment. Now, the human element was the challenge, holding them accountable, demanding recognition, and forcing my family to see the woman they'd long dismissed as fragile and dramatic as someone whose life mattered, whose voice demanded respect. The confrontation was no longer theoretical. It was here, unfolding in the hospital room, and it was mine to command. As I finished speaking, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and empowerment. My chest still ached, but not only from my heart. It ached from the years of holding my truth hostage. Yet with every word, every factual declaration, I felt lighter, as though I had finally shed the burden of secrecy. I knew there would be backlash, that their defenses wouldn't vanish overnight, that some relationships might fracture entirely. But for the first time, I wasn't shrinking to fit their expectations. I was standing fully in my truth. And in that moment, I understood something profoundly important. The choice to speak, though terrifying, was the first real step towards liberation. My life and the recognition of my reality depended on it.
The confrontation didn't take long to escalate once my family realized that speaking dismissively was no longer an option. My mother, the pillar of authority in our household for decades, suddenly became the most volatile presence in the room.
Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, she leaned forward slightly, her voice sharp and almost defensive. "Emily, I cannot believe you're doing this. You're embarrassing yourself and us. You're making a scene in front of the doctors and staff. This is not how a responsible adult behaves." The words hit me with the weight of years of prior accusations, but they had a different sting now because I knew they were irrelevant. The truth had shifted the power dynamic, and for the first time, I was unwilling to back down. I met her gaze steadily, letting the oxygen from the mask fill my lungs and steady the rapid thuds of my heart. "Mom, this isn't about embarrassment. This is about my life. Do you understand? I could have died last night. I could still be in serious danger. And the reason I'm here alive is because professionals believed me. Finally. Not you, not Claire, not Dad, them. So stop trying to control the narrative. You were wrong, and it's time to accept that." Her nostrils flared as she hissed, "You think you know better than us? You think you can just disregard everything we've taught you and your own upbringing?" I could feel her anger radiating toward me, a kind of raw, personal antagonism that had defined my entire life under her scrutiny. Yet I realized that this confrontation was necessary. I had to face her defiance head-on, because if I allowed her to dismiss me again, the truth would lose its power. Claire's smirk had but vanished. She was shifting her weight from foot to foot, her eyes darting toward my father, as though she were looking for a teammate in the showdown. "You're really going overboard," she said, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. "You're acting like this is some crisis just to get attention. Honestly, it's exhausting." I shook my head, the words finally coming with conviction that made my voice stronger than I expected. "Claire, I am not acting. I am documenting. I am alive, and I am taking control of a situation that you have spent years belittling. This is real. You want to call it attention-seeking? Fine. But look at the evidence. EKGs, lab tests, the observations from the paramedics. This is proof. You can argue with me, but you cannot argue with the facts. And the facts say that I was, am, and will continue to be dangerously unwell unless I am taken seriously." My father finally spoke, his voice low but firm, trying to assert authority in the room, though the strength behind his words was weaker than usual. "Emily, you're scaring everyone. We've seen doctors overreact before. Are you sure this isn't just a series of exaggerated symptoms? You've always been sensitive." I let out a slow breath, gathering the patience I hadn't realized I still possessed. "Dad, the sensitivity you're calling exaggeration is called a warning system for a life-threatening condition. My body is telling me something is wrong. I ignored it for years because I was scared you wouldn't believe me. But now we have doctors, medical tests, and professionals who can confirm what I've been saying all along. I am not exaggerating. You cannot dismiss this anymore." At that moment, the room felt charged with tension. My mother's face was red, her hands trembling as she struggled to assert dominance in a battle she could no longer control. Claire's smirk had but vanished. She was shifting her weight from foot to foot, her eyes darting toward my father, as though she were looking for a teammate in the showdown. My father's lips pressed together, the reality of my words sinking in like a slow, heavy tide. Even Greg seemed torn, caught between the shock of truth and the conditioning of years of family loyalty. The paramedic who had accompanied me earlier, Mark, and even the nurses seemed to sense the confrontation's intensity. Their presence, though silent, acted as a subtle reinforcement of the truth. It was no longer my word against my family's. There were professional witnesses, official records, and the irrefutable evidence of my collapsing body. The scales of power had shifted, and I was finally standing on the side of incontrovertible proof. My mother, however, refused to fold easily. "So you're saying all these years I've been wrong? That everything I told you about toughening up and handling your life was nothing?" Her voice cracked, a mixture of anger and fear. "Do you even realize how humiliating this is for us?" I shook my head, resolute. "Mom, it's humiliating because you finally have to confront the truth. That's not my problem anymore. This is about my life.
I'm speaking for myself because no one else has been willing to do it. Your humiliation is not my concern. My survival is." Claire's voice rose then, sharp and panicked. "This is ridiculous. You're making everyone uncomfortable. You're turning a simple hospital visit into a spectacle." I leaned forward slightly, my oxygen mask doing nothing to muffle the clarity in my words. "Yes, I am making everyone uncomfortable, and yes, this is a spectacle, but it's one that's necessary. You've all been comfortable ignoring me for years, comfortable dismissing me, comfortable pretending I wasn't struggling. That ends now. The evidence is undeniable. I am real. My condition is real, and you all need to face that reality."
The confrontation stretched on. Every accusation, every denial met with facts, proof, and a voice that refused to break. By the time the hospital shift changed and new nurses peeked into the room, the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. My family was no longer in control. Their authority, built over decades of fear and denial, had been challenged by the clarity of my truth, the objectivity of medical evidence, and my willingness to confront them. For the first time, I saw cracks in their armor, hesitation in my mother's voice, uncertainty in my father's stance, discomfort in Claire's expressions. Even Greg, who had always been silent, seemed closer to understanding, closer to acknowledging the reality that had been obvious to me all along. The confrontation had reached a turning point. The antagonist, the collective disbelief, dismissal, and denial my family had wielded for years, was no longer unchallenged. And as I lay there, tired but resolute, I realized that this moment, the confrontation, the exposing of their disbelief, the facing down of their resistance, was the crucible that would define everything to come. The truth had been laid bare, the stakes made real, and now nothing could stop it from unfolding fully. I was no longer hiding, I was no longer silenced, and I was ready for the fallout, whatever it might bring. The hours following the confrontation felt like being caught in a storm with no shelter. The truth had been spoken, undeniable and exposed, yet the backlash was immediate and exhausting. My family retreated into a mix of resentment, disbelief, and simmering anger, leaving me caught in the tension that I had both initiated and could not control. My mother refused to speak to me for long stretches, retreating into her room with a closed door and a furrowed brow, while my father lingered in the hallway, muttering to himself, and occasionally glancing into the room as if seeking reassurance that the situation was still manageable. Claire hovered near the entrance, her arms crossed, lips pressed in a thin line, clearly unwilling to fully acknowledge what had happened, but equally unwilling to step away entirely. Greg remained the only one who seemed willing to listen, but even his presence brought little comfort, as I could sense his internal conflict in every hesitant glance and careful word. I lay in the hospital bed, the hum of machines around me both a comfort and a constant reminder of my vulnerability. My heart still raced at irregular intervals, each flutter sending a wave of panic through my body. The oxygen mask on my face made me feel simultaneously protected and trapped, a physical symbol of the precarious state I was in. My thoughts spiraled, a tangle of fear, grief, and exhaustion. For years, I had internalized the belief that I was exaggerating, that my feelings and experiences were invalid. Now, even as the evidence confirmed my reality, the emotional toll of years of dismissal hit me with full force. I was free in some ways, but in others I felt more isolated than ever. The hospital room felt colder than it had during the day. The light from the overhead fluorescent seemed harsh, casting shadows that mirrored the turmoil inside me. Every time a nurse entered, I forced a smile, hoping to appear composed, while internally I was unraveling. I thought of my mother's angry, incredulous gaze, of Claire's judgmental smirk, of my father's dismissive muttering, and I felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. Even Mark, who had consistently stood by me, could not erase the weight of familial rejection. The people who should have been my first line of support were now the source of my deepest emotional struggle. A new nurse came in to check my vitals, her gentle tone a small relief amidst the storm. "How are you feeling?" she asked, carefully noting my pulse and oxygen levels. I forced myself to answer, my voice a quiet whisper. "Tired, frustrated, scared." She nodded, her expression compassionate but professional. "It's okay to feel that way. You've been through a lot in the past 24 hours. It's normal for all these emotions to hit at once." Her words offered momentary solace, but they could not erase the gnawing sense that my family's disbelief lingered, even after I had spoken so clearly, so firmly, and with undeniable proof. By mid-afternoon, my family had returned to the hospital, ostensibly to check on me, but their presence felt more like scrutiny than support. My mother hovered near the door, her expression a mix of apprehension and irritation. My father paced the hallway outside, muttering numbers and complaints about hospital procedures. Claire's posture was rigid, arms crossed, and she avoided eye contact entirely. Greg remained the only one who seemed willing to listen, but even his presence brought little comfort, as I could sense his internal conflict in every hesitant glance and careful word.
I wanted to speak again, to assert myself, to remind them that the evidence was undeniable, but exhaustion weighed heavily on me. My body was tired from the collapse, from the ongoing irregular heartbeats, from the medication that left me lightheaded and drained. My mind was tired from navigating the storm of emotions, both my own and my family's. I realized, painfully, that even the truth could not immediately heal the fractures, could not instantly generate empathy, and could not erase years of neglect and disbelief. As evening fell, the room grew quiet, except for the steady beeping of the monitors. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the isolation of my reality acutely. The truth was out, undeniable, but the consequences of speaking it were only now becoming apparent. The confrontation had stripped away illusions, but it had also left raw wounds, resentment, defensiveness, and the lingering question of whether my family could ever truly see me for who I was. In that dark night of the soul, I understood that validation and proof were not enough. Even as professionals documented my condition and confirmed the reality of my suffering, the emotional toll of years of dismissal could not be erased overnight. Speaking the truth had been necessary, but it had also brought me to the lowest point, forcing me to confront the uncomfortable reality that truth and recognition were sometimes separate from comfort and support. I felt exposed, fragile, and uncertain whether the choice to speak would ultimately heal the bonds I had spent years trying to protect. And yet, even in the weight of exhaustion, fear, and emotional turbulence, a small ember of resolve remained. The evidence was on my side. My voice had been heard. My truth was undeniable. It was only a matter of time before the world around me, and perhaps even my family, would have to acknowledge it fully. For now, though, I lay in the hospital bed, vulnerable and raw, facing the consequences of finally claiming my reality, and understanding that even truth carries its own heavy cost. The morning light poured through the hospital window, and for the first time since I had collapsed, I felt a glimmer of clarity amid the haze of exhaustion and anxiety. Today was different. Today, the confrontation with the truth would no longer be private or contained within whispered denials and tense hospital rooms. Today, my family, the medical staff, and I would face the undeniable reality together, in a way that demanded accountability, acknowledgement, and transparency. Dr. Lawson had arranged a formal consultation with the cardiology team, complete with all my test results, scans, and monitoring data. She had insisted that my family be present to witness firsthand the evidence that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. As I sat up, cautiously adjusting the thin hospital gown over my shoulders,
I felt a mixture of fear and resolve settle in my chest. This was the moment when my reality would be placed firmly in the open, and the narrative that had haunted me for years would finally be confronted publicly. My family arrived punctually, though their expressions ranged from tension to outright skepticism. My mother's lips were pressed into a thin, tight line, her arms folded defensively across her chest. My father lingered near the doorway, hands in his pockets, projecting an uneasy authority that had always masked his uncertainty. Claire hovered near the back, her posture rigid, eyes darting between the doctors and me, unwilling to fully commit to acknowledgement. Greg predictably stayed closest to me, offering a silent support that I clung to desperately. Mark, my steadfast ally, had been allowed to attend as well, and his calm, reassuring presence grounded me as I prepared to present myself, my body, and my experience in a way that could no longer be ignored. Dr. Lawson began the session, her tone deliberate and professional. "We are here today to review Emily's condition," she said, motioning toward the scans and charts arrayed neatly on the table beside her. "These documents, lab results, and monitoring records provide objective evidence of a serious cardiac condition. Emily has experienced arrhythmias and inflammation of the heart muscle, myocarditis, that silent as she began presenting the EKG strips, the echocardiogram images, and the lab results. Each scan, each chart was a visual confirmation of what my body had been trying to tell me for months, if not years." I watched my mother's eyes widen slightly as the images were displayed. Her hands, which had been clenched tightly, now trembled imperceptibly. Claire's smirk vanished entirely, replaced by the uncertainty of someone being confronted with evidence they could not refute. My father's jaw tightened, and he exhaled audibly, the weight of undeniable facts pressing down on him in a way that years of dismissive authority never had. Even Greg, though still hesitant, seemed to finally grasp the severity of my reality, his hand brushing lightly against mine in a silent gesture of support. Dr. Lawson continued, pointing to the EKG printouts. "You can see here that Emily's heart rhythm is irregular. These episodes can lead to fainting, chest pain, or even sudden cardiac arrest. The inflammation in the heart muscle is measurable and significant, and the paramedics documented her collapse with precise observations. Every step in this timeline is corroborated by medical evidence." Her words hit with the weight of finality. This was no longer a debate. The truth was laid bare, public, and indisputable.
My mother's voice finally broke the silence, though it was unsteady. "But how? How could we have not known?" she asked, a mix of fear, guilt, and disbelief woven through her words. Her usual posture of defensive authority faltered, revealing a vulnerability she rarely displayed. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I let the charts, the images, and the voices of the professionals speak for me. Claire, almost whispering, added, "So you weren't just faking." The words were barely audible, yet they carried the weight of a long-held misconception crumbling. I shook my head, feeling a surge of empowerment, tempered by exhaustion. No, I was never faking. Every symptom, every collapse, every fear I voiced, it was all real, and now you can see it for yourselves. Dr. Lawson nodded, acknowledging the moment without judgment. This is why objective evidence is critical. It removes doubt, confronts skepticism, and protects patients. Emily's condition has been ignored for too long, and the danger was very real. Our goal now is to focus on treatment and recovery and to ensure that her health is managed appropriately moving forward. As she spoke, I glanced around the room at my family. The skepticism, the denial, the dismissiveness, they were all eroding. My mother's hands were no longer clenched. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. My father's posture had softened slightly, though his expression remained guarded. Claire sat back, clearly grappling with the undeniable facts she could no longer dispute. Greg met my gaze, a subtle nod confirming he understood the depth of what had occurred. I realized then that this was more than just a medical discussion. It was a trial of truth, and the evidence had swayed the jury. The emotional weight, the family dynamics, the long history of dismissal, all of it was being confronted in a way that could no longer be ignored or rewritten. I had spoken. I had shown the proof. And now I was being acknowledged, validated, and finally, for the first time in years, taken seriously. By the time the meeting concluded, the atmosphere in the room had shifted irreversibly. The professionals had departed, leaving my family with the evidence, the images, and the undeniable truth. My mother's face was pale, her lips trembling as she muttered, I didn't realize. My father's stance softened, and he finally said, Emily, I'm sorry. Clara was still processing, but the tension in her body had eased slightly. Greg's hand squeezed mine gently, a quiet affirmation that I wasn't alone. I leaned back against the pillow, chest still fluttering with irregular beats, but heart full with a complex mixture of relief, empowerment, and exhaustion. The truth had been laid bare, witnessed, and documented. My voice had been heard, and the reality I had carried alone for so long was finally recognized. I had survived the trial of scrutiny, confrontation, and disbelief, and the victory was not only medical, but profoundly personal. The days that followed the hospital consultation felt surreal, like stepping into a world that had shifted subtly yet irrevocably beneath my feet. For the first time in years, my family was beginning to acknowledge not just my symptoms, but the depth of my experience, the reality of my vulnerability, and the danger they had dismissed for too long. The tension that had defined every interaction seemed to loosen, replaced by cautious attentiveness, an almost tangible effort to rebuild trust and understanding. My mother, who had always been quick to assert authority and dismiss concerns, began asking questions. Not accusatory, but curious and careful, trying to understand what I had endured. She would sit by my bedside asking about my medications, the triggers for my arrhythmias, and the doctor's recommendations, genuinely listening in a way she never had before. Each question, though small, felt like a bridge being built over years of denial. My father, too, showed subtle changes. While he remained stoic, the defensiveness that had once defined his interactions had faded slightly. He began attending follow-up appointments with me, asking the doctors questions about my condition in a respectful, concerned tone. It wasn't easy for him. The pride and habitual authority that had governed him for decades clashed with the humility required to truly acknowledge that he had been wrong. Yet his presence, steady and patient, signaled a willingness to accept reality and support me in ways that had seemed impossible just a week ago. The transformation was not dramatic, but it was consistent, and over time it became undeniable. Claire, who had always been the most judgmental and dismissive, slowly began to soften. She stopped rolling her eyes at my hospital visits and ceased making sarcastic comments about my drama. Instead, she began to ask how I was feeling, what activities I could safely undertake, and how she could help with meals or errands. It was awkward at first, her gestures tentative and clumsy, but the effort was there. Even small acts of acknowledgement mattered. The sisters who had once laughed at my fainting spells were now learning, slowly and imperfectly, to witness my reality without ridicule.
Greg remained my anchor, the one family member who had consistently believed me even when everyone else doubted. He had quietly coordinated my follow-up appointments, ensured that medications were administered correctly, and monitored my recovery closely. His presence provided a stabilizing force, a reminder that while the journey toward full recognition and understanding was ongoing, I was not alone. Mark, the paramedic who had first documented my collapse, continued to check in with updates and guidance, offering reassurance that the medical care I received was accurate and that my experience was valid. The most profound shift, however, was internal. I felt a sense of empowerment and validation that I had never known before. The constant anxiety of being dismissed or accused of exaggeration began to ebb, replaced by a cautious confidence. I could now speak openly about my health, about the fainting spells, the chest pain, and the limitations imposed by my condition without fearing immediate ridicule or denial. My voice, once suppressed by years of skepticism, was now recognized and respected. This acknowledgement was not just emotional, it had tangible effects on my daily life. I was allowed to rest without guilt, to advocate for my own needs, and to participate in medical decisions about my treatment. Over time, routines were established that balanced my health needs with family life. My mother learned how to manage dietary considerations and medication schedules. My father helped coordinate transportation to follow-up visits, and Claire began assisting with minor tasks that allowed me to conserve energy. The family dynamic, once defined by dismissal and skepticism, slowly evolved into one of cautious cooperation, grounded in an acknowledgement of reality and a shared commitment to my well-being. Therapy became a crucial component of recovery, not just for my physical health, but for the emotional trauma of years of disbelief. I began meeting with a counselor to unpack the long-term effects of being invalidated and to develop strategies for setting boundaries and communicating clearly about my condition. These sessions were difficult, sometimes emotionally exhausting, but they provided a framework for reclaiming my agency and rebuilding a sense of self-worth that had been eroded over time. Friends and colleagues who had often witnessed my struggles without fully understanding them now saw a different narrative. I could explain my condition with clarity and confidence, presenting the facts as they were, supported by medical documentation. The change was subtle but powerful. People no longer questioned my experiences, and I no longer felt the need to defend my reality preemptively. The validation I had longed for was finally integrated into my daily interactions, both personal and professional. Even as life began to normalize, I remained vigilant. My health required ongoing attention, and the scars, emotional and physical, remained. Yet the equilibrium I had achieved was profound, a recognition of my truth, the establishment of boundaries, and the support of family members who had gradually shifted from denial to engagement. I had learned that validation and acknowledgement were not given freely. They were earned through persistence, courage, and the unwavering presentation of fact and experience. The transformation was not perfect. Arguments still arose, frustrations occasionally bubbled to the surface, and skepticism lingered in subtle forms. But these moments were navigable now, grounded in the knowledge that my reality was documented, undeniable, and respected by both medical professionals and those who had once doubted me. The balance was fragile, but sustainable, a testament to the power of truth, advocacy, and resilience. As I lay in my room one evening, the soft glow of the setting sun casting warm light across the hospital bed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From collapse to confrontation, from denial to acknowledgement, the path had been exhausting, emotionally raw, and profoundly transformative. I had emerged not just alive, but empowered, validated, and equipped with the tools to navigate both my health and the complex dynamics of family relationships. The equilibrium I now inhabited was built on truth, fortified by evidence, and strengthened by courage. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. My life had been interrupted by crisis, but through persistence, documentation, and confrontation, I had carved out a space where my reality was recognized and respected. This new equilibrium was not just a return to daily routines, it was a reclamation of agency, voice, and the right to be seen and heard without question. The journey was ongoing, but I had crossed the threshold from being silenced and dismissed to being empowered, validated, and supported. The months following my hospitalization were a study in both resilience and transformation. What had once been a series of crises, each punctuated by fainting spells, dismissals, and disbelief, evolved into a structured, managed life where my health and my voice were no longer negotiable. My home, once a battlefield of judgment and skepticism, became a space of cautious understanding. My mother,
initially resistant and defensive, had begun to attend support sessions with me, learning not just about the mechanics of my condition, but also about the emotional impact of years of invalidation. She no longer brushed off my symptoms or insisted that I toughen up when my chest tightened or my heart raced. Instead, she listened, asked questions, and offered practical help, carefully preparing meals, reminding me of medication schedules, and monitoring my energy levels during activity. Each act, while small, symbolized a shift from control and skepticism to empathy and partnership.
My father, whose pride had long prevented him from admitting fault or acknowledging vulnerability, now walked the delicate line between concern and humility. He attended cardiology appointments with me, taking notes, asking precise questions, and ensuring that the medical advice I received was implemented correctly. His tone softened, the defensiveness replaced by a quiet dedication to my well-being. While old habits did surface occasionally, the consistency of his engagement signaled a genuine effort to reconcile with past misjudgments. Even Claire, my once cynical sister, began participating in ways that surprised me, offering to drive me to appointments, helping with grocery runs, and asking thoughtful, respectful questions about my recovery. The smirk and sarcasm had been replaced by careful observation, a willingness to engage, and, over time, genuine acknowledgement of the years she had doubted me. Greg remained my steady ally throughout this transformation, a constant presence who had believed me from the very start. His support now extended beyond family logistics. He advocated for me in medical consultations, assisted with lifestyle adjustments, and provided emotional reassurance when the past crept back into our daily lives. Mark, the paramedic who had first documented my collapse, remained a source of guidance, helping me navigate the ongoing intricacies of my condition while reinforcing the legitimacy of my experience. Between medical professionals, family, and close friends, the network of validation I had long sought began to solidify, creating an environment where my voice was no longer dismissed but valued. Internally, the transformation was just as profound. The months of therapy, journaling, and structured reflection allowed me to untangle years of accumulated self-doubt. I had spent decades second-guessing my perceptions, apologizing for symptoms, and internalizing blame. Now, with the medical evidence firmly established and my family gradually acknowledging their missteps, I found the courage to reclaim my narrative. I spoke openly about my condition, the fainting spells, the chest pains, and the mental strain of being dismissed, and I no longer felt the compulsion to qualify or soften my words. My experience was real, documented, and respected, and that truth became the foundation of a newfound confidence that touched every part of my life. This internal and external shift allowed me to engage more fully with the world. Work, previously a source of anxiety and overexertion, became manageable through structured schedules and clear communication about my limitations. Social interactions, once fraught with fear of disbelief or judgment, became opportunities to educate, advocate, and form connections grounded in authenticity. I could now explain my heart condition, fainting episodes, and recovery protocols without preemptive apology or defensiveness, and people responded with concern and respect rather than skepticism. For the first time, I realized that empowerment came not only from surviving a crisis, but from controlling the narrative of my own health and life. The final symbolic aspect of this transformation emerged as I began volunteering with a local organization supporting individuals with chronic and invisible health conditions. My experience, once shrouded in doubt, mockery, and dismissal, became a beacon for others navigating similar struggles. I shared my story at workshops, guided new patients through navigating medical systems, and counseled family members on listening, empathy, and validation.
The vulnerability that had once made me a target for skepticism was now a tool for connection and empowerment, and the sense of purpose it gave me reinforced the profound impact of reclaiming my voice. At home, routines solidified into a structure that balanced care with autonomy. I learned to recognize early warning signs of arrhythmias, manage rest periods effectively, and communicate honestly with family members when energy levels were low. My family, now attuned to my needs, responded appropriately, providing support without condescension. The once tense dynamics had shifted. Conversations were calmer, guidance was constructive rather than dismissive, and empathy became the dominant mode of interaction. Even minor gestures, a note reminding me to take my medication, a shared meal prepared according to dietary guidelines, took on profound significance, symbolizing a household that had learned to respect both my health and my voice.
The final image of this journey, however, was more than routines or validation. It was a reflection of personal resilience and transformation. I often sit on the porch in the early morning, the cool air brushing my face, my heart steady, my body alert but calm, reflecting on how far I've come. The girl who once collapsed during a family dinner, accused of faking, silenced and dismissed, has evolved into a woman who is seen, heard, and respected. My experiences shaped not only my understanding of vulnerability, but also my capacity for courage, advocacy, and empowerment. The scars, both emotional and physical, remain, but they are no longer sources of shame. They are markers of survival, testimony to resilience, and symbols of truth reclaimed. As the sun rises and the world continues beyond my porch, I am reminded that transformation is not a single moment, but a process, a combination of courage, evidence, confrontation, and persistence. The collapse, the confrontation, the trials, each was a step toward clarity, validation, and empowerment. I have found peace not only in my physical health, but in the acknowledgement of my truth, the restoration of family relationships, and the purpose I now carry to guide and support others. The journey has been arduous, painful, and profoundly human, but it has culminated in a life defined not by dismissal or doubt, but by resilience, understanding, and the enduring power of speaking one's truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.